Shaw, and I currently serve as the Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Howard University. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Gwendolyn and Colbert King Endowed Chair for Public Policy lecture series. It is my honor to welcome this year's chair, the Honorable James Comey. Mr. Comey needs no introduction, but just very briefly, he attended William and Mary College, where he received his undergraduate degree, and then attended law school at the University of Chicago. He ultimately served as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and then entered the private world, where he served as General Counsel and Vice President with Lockheed Martin. In 2013, he was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve as the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. As Howard University's history and our legacy is steeped in social justice, I'm pleased for the discussion that will take place today, focusing on civil rights and a number of other areas that will be of importance to our students. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Honorable James Comey.
Did I get it? I got it. Good.
Okay.
Because I'm going to make my guest today introduce himself, because he'll be a much more interesting speaker than I asked him to come up on stage. My partner in this conversation today is someone I've come to know and admire, someone who is new to the Howard community, and I believe you will conclude, as I have, is a gift to the Howard community. And I thought, after having conversation with my guest up here today, that all of us would benefit from having a conversation as a group. And so what I propose to do today is for my partner up on stage and I to question each other and ask each other hard questions and probe each other to stimulate you in the second part of this presentation, then ask your own hard questions. No tricky questions, just hard questions. And we will do our best to engage and to answer as honestly as we can and to critique each other's answers as makes sense. So that's how I imagine it going. We're going to talk to each other with you as behind the fourth wall, watching the conversation, and then we're going to invite you into the conversation to ask whatever you'd like to ask. Okay? So without further ado, I'm joined here on the stage by Justin Hansford, who is the director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard, which is a brand new enterprise at Howard that I'm going to ask him to say a little bit more about. Let me start by saying welcome, Justin. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
All right, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. And so my first question, as I promised the audience, is tell us your story.
All right, so for me, this is really about a homecoming story. So I was someone who went to Howard University. My mother, my uncle, my grandmother, and my grandfather are all Howard people who attended Howard. So for me, I have memories of being here in Founders as a student, as someone who studied English and African American studies. Dr. Carr was my favorite professor. Some of you may have studied under him. And for me, it's a place where I think of family and I think of home when I think of Howard. I even like to use our chant where I say, H-U? No. So that's a chant we have amongst the Howard family to recognize each other and to show that we see each other and that we respect each other and that we're in a unified movement to try to promote social change. So for me to be a part of that is a great honor and a privilege. And so when I left Howard, I had become someone who studied Black history. I minored in African American studies, as I mentioned, but I had not been able to be engaged in a movement that was happening to the degree that the civil rights movement happened in the 60s until I finished law school. I began to get involved in activism.
Where'd you go to law school?
I went to law school at Georgetown, school down the street.
We've heard of it.
Yeah, you've heard of it. I learned about critical race theory, which is a theory on how to use the law to create racial justice, promoted by Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and other major critical race theory scholars. I worked for your former boss, President Obama, on his 2008 campaign, I was in the White House briefly, but then I decided I wanted to be a law professor like Derek Bell, like Kimberly Crenshaw. So I moved to St. Louis, Missouri, the Midwest, and it's a place I never would have thought I would have ended up. But I went there. It was a small town. I was studying, I was writing. I had no idea that one day it would become the center of the universe for issues around social justice and racial justice. And I'll never forget, I lived 10 minutes away from Ferguson. And I'll never forget that first night when I went out there and people were facing tear gas, people were facing rubber bullets being shot at them. You know, it was hot. It was dangerous. We didn't know what was going to happen, but people were doing all that because they believed in something. They believed in the cause, and it was my cause. It was the cause that I had studied here at Howard all of those years earlier. So I got involved. I was able to help represent Mike Brown's family when we went to the United Nations in Geneva and argued that the issues surrounding racial justice were not only civil rights issues, but they were human rights issues. It's something that one of my heroes, Malcolm X, had discussed before he passed. This movement from just a civil rights framework to a human rights framework. So I was able to get involved in that. I was able to protest, and eventually I found my way back to Washington, D.C. I was offered this opportunity to come back home and be able to, for me, it's a chance to be able to bring the movement from Ferguson here to Howard, back to where I was born and raised. And so it's a great privilege for me to be back here, to be a part of that process.
Great, great. It's a great story. And before I move to the center, one other thing, where'd you grow up?
I grew up so I was born in GW Hospital. I grew up in the Petworth neighborhood and then in Silver Spring, Maryland. And then I lived in DC ever since.
Great, great story. So tell the audience about the center. What is it? What are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish?
Well, there's nothing like this has ever been attempted at an HBCU. And I think if you were to look around the country, even the major universities in our country have never attempted what we're going to try to attempt at the Thurgood Marshall Center. What we are doing is we are taking some of the best minds from the law school who focus on civil rights and human rights, and we are in a partnership seeking to promote the intellectual engagement, the advocacy engagement, and also the public engagement of the entire university using the law school's Thurgood Marshall Center as a platform. So there are 3 prongs to the center that we are seeking to fulfill. From an intellectual standpoint, we want to engage people's minds. We want to have monthly book clubs. We want to have a debate on a monthly basis where we talk about major social justice issues in the Oxford debate style. So there's this website for people who are listening, who have access to the internet. There's this website called Intelligence Squared. I'm a big fan of the website. If you go to that website, you'll see that people are able to engage experts in the field on some of the most important points of debate around justice, criminal justice, whether to legalize marijuana, whether to, or how are we going to fight against mass incarceration. So we want to have a space where people can debate ideas. Also, it's going to be a space where people can engage in advocacy along with the help of our Civil and Human Rights Clinic. Right now, we are engaged in a number of cases in our clinic, including reparations cases we're working on. We're working on cases involving Black Lives Matter in partnership with the Mike Brown Foundation. I'm on the board of that foundation. We are working on cases involving the rights of prisoners. You know, the new Jim Crow has been banned in some prisons. Some of you may have heard about that. In New Jersey and in North Carolina, they banned the book, The New Jim Crow. If anybody needed to read the book, The New Jim Crow, it's people who are currently incarcerated. And we see that happening in prisons around the country. Right now, we're working on fighting that in Michigan. So we have these cases that we're going to be fighting in the courts, in the places where we have testimony around new legislation, and that's going to be our advocacy mission. And also, we're going to have a public engagement mission. So I think about the Highlander Center. I think about the tradition of organizing and trying to help the people on the ground lead the movement for change. And so my question as the leader of the center is, how can I get students to be empowered to go out into Ward 8 in Southeast DC and have sessions there where they talk to people about human rights. How can we bring the most important civil rights and human rights organizations in the country over to Howard so they can have their strategy sessions here on our campus? And so we're hoping to build social capital through that third aspect of our center. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I think that we're going to do it in the best tradition of the university, because that's what we do. We make social change on a global level.
And what do you say to people who may be listening thinking, well, that sounds like a law student deal?
Yeah, well, no, it's the deal of anybody who wants to make a difference. For many of us who went to law school, that's why we entered law school in the first place. For me, I really don't care that much about law. I care about justice. And for me, this is a space where we're going to create more justice, especially for people who are engaged in something like the Black Lives Matter movement, because that's what motivated me. That's what got me to the table in the first place.
Good.
So that's my story. So Jim, what about you? I know you are someone who has a very interesting background, studying social justice as a young person, and over the course of your career, you end up as the director of the FBI. And I'm wondering how this story unfolded and what brought you to the place where you are today.
It's a great question. I have no idea. All I know is I got fired, so I'm not in that job anymore.
That's right.
I tell young people life is a weird journey sometimes, and no plan survives first contact with life. I knew, because of the way my parents raised us, that I wanted to be somebody who tried to do something for other people. That was just a thing in my family, that whatever your talents, you should find a way to help people who need you. And I thought I wanted to be a doctor, and that's the way I would help people. And I went to William & Mary and majored in chemistry because I thought most pre-med people major in bio, so maybe I'd have a leg up by majoring in chemistry. That was a disaster, but I stayed with chemistry thinking I'd be a doctor. One day I'm walking through the chem lab building, and I see the word death on a bulletin board. And so I stop, and it's an advertisement for a course. And I end up knowing the professor who said most places call that death and dying. He said, that's too depressing. I call it just death. And so I had a hole in my schedule, and I signed up for it. And this guy turned out to be an ethicist, an immigrant, who was one of the most powerful influences on my life that ever happened. It happened by accident, who demanded that you show your work and open your mind. Understand other points of view, understand proposals, ideas, words different than your own, and meet them head on. Strip away your biases and meet them head on. So that was a huge influence on me. I ended up majoring in religious studies, in religion it was called then, and being introduced to a theologian who had a huge influence on me, as on many others, including Dr. King, named Reinhold Niebuhr. And Reinhold Niebuhr taught, the world is a terrible place, and people are awful, and people really can't love another human being as themselves. It's impossible. But so what? You shouldn't give up. Your obligation as a believer is to try and pursue justice. And then Niebuhr went one step further and said the place to pursue justice is in the public square, because that's where power is. You can't pursue justice in your own home. You can't pursue justice in a club with your friends. You got to get out there with other people and pursue it. So all this started to weigh on me. And then one other influence, and I'll shut up. I was a white kid from a small town in northern New Jersey in Bergen County. There's only one other black family in my town. They lived on my street, the Jacksons, almost an entirely white high school. And I go to William & Mary, and William & Mary, just by accident, puts me in a suite with another 18-year-old from inner city Philadelphia named Greg Sampson, who was African American. And our lives couldn't have been more different. I arrived at William & Mary. My parents drove me. They stayed in a hotel. They helped arrange my room. My mother was nervous about where posters should go. Greg arrived. His mom put him on a bus in Philadelphia with all of his belongings in a duffel bag. He had never been to the campus. He arrives at the campus, and he walks from the bus station. The first building he sees, he knocks on the door. It's the president's house by accident. And the president of William & Mary opens the door and says, how may I help you? And Greg Sampson says, I'm Greg Sampson, I'm here. And the president of William & Mary says, yeah, great. Go over there and check in. My friendship with Greg Sampson, which has lasted, he's a juvenile court judge in West Baltimore, changed me in a huge way and helped me see the world just in a different way. Lit a flame in me to understand different people in a way I didn't before. It lit such a flame. I was a journalist in college. I wrote a long series about the experience of black students at William & Mary. And I tried to interview, and nearly did, every black student at William & Mary. A bit depressing that I might actually be able to do that. Shows you the numbers weren't all that big. And then wrote about black faculty and wrote about recruitment because I had seen the world in a different way. So all that came together, and I decided, you know what? I think I'd be better engaging in seeking justice as a lawyer, because that's where justice is found, not in a hospital, at least I didn't see it that way, but in the public square. So I go to the University of Chicago, because it was the best school that accepted me, and I work in the legal clinic representing poor people who had their disability claims denied. I didn't even try out for the law review because I loved the legal clinic so much and didn't know what kind of lawyer I would be. I get a clerkship for a federal judge in Manhattan. I'm sitting in the courtroom one day, and I'm watching the government try and detain Fat Tony Salerno, who was the boss of the Genovese crime family, a mafia family, the ultimate bullies, taking over neighborhoods and terrorized people. And I watched this, and they're playing tapes that the FBI made in a bug they had under his table in his social club. And you could hear him ordering people killed and breaking people's legs. And I thought, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. That's what I want to do. I can help people that way. And so I decided I'd become a federal prosecutor. And it's a long, tortured journey since then, but that's what I was going to do with my entire life. Did it in New York, and then I moved to Richmond, Virginia to do it. And my life changed because of 9/11 in ways I won't go into, but that passion, especially to represent victims, is what animated me and drove me to become a lawyer and to become a prosecutor. And now I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. I'm writing a book that I hope will be useful to people, and I'm going to teach. I've learned a ton being here. I'm going to try and take some of that elsewhere and teach, and can try to be involved in the public square in trying to achieve some measure of justice. That's too long a story. You told your story better. Yeah. So let me ask you a question now.
All right.
You talked about your experience, again, kind of by accident, right, in St. Louis. You didn't go to St. Louis to get involved with Mike Brown and with Ferguson and with Black Lives Matter. Fate drew you there. So tell us some of the key lessons you drew from that incredible experience.
Well, I would say the most important lesson I drew was that we are the movement that we've been waiting for. This generation of young people have a measure of courage and commitment that has left me in awe. I think about the first night when I went out to West Florissant, which was the street where most of the protests took place. Again, I'm someone who has been involved in advocacy around police brutality and racial justice for maybe 10 years at that point. But I see people who are teenagers, 18, 19 years old, going out there, staying after curfew out on the street, standing in front of police officers who are calling them racial slurs, who are pointing guns at them. We don't know if those guns have live ammunition in them at that point or if they're just rubber bullets. There are people who got shot with rubber bullets who lost the use of their eyes. One young lady who was a Howard alum was shot in her forehead by one of these rubber bullets. She's barely survived. She's still a spoken word artist, and I think some students met with her when they went to St. Louis for alternative spring break. So they put their bodies on the line. I think of people like Josh, people who, is a young protester, who's a teenager who is now incarcerated based on, some of the things that happened during that time. People put their lives on the line for an idea. The idea was that this has been going on, as you know, for generations. This meaning police violence, racialized police violence, has been going on for generations. But this is the generation where they said no more. We didn't know the term or the hashtag Black Lives Matter when we started protesting. It wasn't about a hashtag. It was about something in your heart that made you say that I'm going to stay out there even if it kills me, literally. And I still admire those people's courage. I'm someone who has been a follower of those protesters, and I've seen the impact they've had on the culture. This weekend we have a movie coming out. I forget the name of it. They know the name of it. But there's a movie coming out that celebrates black culture. We've had, over the course of the past 3.5 years, so many Netflix series and so many op-eds and so many pieces of culture that have flourished, I believe, in part because of the reawakening that took place in Ferguson, I believe that it was the spark that helped to change our culture and to create a new sense of self in the young people, and they were ready for it. They were ready for it from Trayvon Martin, from Oscar Grant for years. They were made ready by Barack Obama. And the courage and the confidence that he inspired in the young people. So the lesson I learned in a nutshell was that the young people of this generation are the ones that are going to make a difference. The second lesson I learned is that police are much more violent than I thought they were. Much more violent than I thought they were. I'm someone, I grew up in DC. I wasn't rich, and I can tell you stories. I know one time when I was a teenager, I'm driving down the street. Police officers, stops me. I've got my little brother in the car, and my little cousin, right on Georgia Avenue. And it was late at night, Saturday night, and he comes up, are you out here trying to buy drugs? And we were just driving home from 7-Eleven, but I have a feeling in my stomach. I'm nervous. I'm trying not to show it because I'm trying to be, the protector. You're the big brother. You're supposed to be tough. So I don't jump when he says jump. He says get out of the car. He makes me bend over the hood. He fills me up very, very aggressively. He's calling me names. He's a black police officer, calling me names, threatening me, and I just cowered. I just sort of just went along with it. I didn't want any trouble. But after I got back in the car, I couldn't look at my little brother and my little cousin because I felt like I lost that big brother protective sort of aura. And it's that use of humiliation as a tactic is something that I started to get used to when dealing with the police. And I knew that they were abusive and they were bullies. But I didn't know until the Ferguson report came out how systemic and how violent the police are. It's not a question of bad apples, it's a question of bad systems. And it's a question of being able to see it on a grand scale that shocked me. That shocked me. I shouldn't have been shocked. I had been pessimistic, I think is the term I would use. But once we started to see these reports come out and we started to see the research done, we saw that all the things that we had said out of frustration, not only were those things true, but it was much worse than we even had imagined. And so I've been shocked by that, and that's continued to motivate my work thus far. So,
well, hold on, before you leave that,
yeah.
Thank you for that. You're now 3 years out plus from August of 2014.
That's right.
What is the arc of that enthusiasm? Right? You said something special was happening with young people. Has it gotten better? Has it depressed? Is it the same?
That's a great question. I think that we have to admit that we're not at a point where people are shutting it down every day or every weekend. I think 1,000 people were killed by police last year. The number has actually gone up from the previous years of 2016, 2015. But the protests have gone down. And so we don't see the same level of willingness to go out en masse, outside of the core activists. I'm talking about en masse, the average person, the average young person. We don't see them in the streets as much as we used to. And I for one, think that's a bad thing. I think it was good when people were in the streets. But I think that the enthusiasm is still there, as demonstrated by the enthusiasm for this movie, as demonstrated by the way that the culture has shifted. People's minds are there. And I think that as long as people are there mentally, there's always the chance for things to continue to transition. We saw with the election of an individual that you know very well, that there's been a change in the focus of the mainstream media. There's been another movement which has risen, the very important movement, the Me Too movement, is also, taking up space. And I think we need to think about intersectionality in the sense of how do we merge these emerging movements and these emerging ideas, and how do we be a part of something broader? I think that's a question that's been unanswered thus far. But I do think that the desire is still there, even if the people aren't protesting with the frequency that they used to protest. Okay, so my question for you. So, as we all know, the FBI has a very challenging history with the African American community. My first major piece of scholarship was on Marcus Garvey, who was investigated by J. Edgar Hoover, framed by J. Edgar Hoover, and we know that the things that happened in terms of COINTELPRO and the murder of Fred Hampton, who was killed with his wife, his pregnant wife, next to him in his bed, and the exile of Assata Shakur, and so many people, Pete O'Neill. So I guess the question is, what were you able to do, if anything, in terms of leadership, to try to shift that organization and change that organization's mission, culture, tactics, strategy, in order to lessen that oppression that historically they have visited upon the black community?
Yeah, that's a hard question. The short answer is probably not enough, but I'll tell you what I tried to do in my 4 years. Probably 3 buckets of things. The first is I tried to make the FBI stare at that history, because I'm a believer that transparency is a good. Transparency, especially about ways in which you have misbehaved, engaged in misconduct, is critical, because all of human history seems to be a repeating of the history you don't remember. And so, among other things, I commissioned a course at Quantico where every new agent and analyst of the FBI studies the history of the FBI, especially the COINTELPRO history, with a special emphasis on the FBI's interaction with Dr. King. And you know that horrific history. And then at the end of the course, all the trainees come to Washington and visit the King Memorial, and they're assigned for their final project. Pick something Dr. King said that are on those 2 amazing arcs of stone on either side of the granite blocks. Pick it and write an essay about how you see that intersecting with the FBI's values. And what I think is really cool about that design is we're not trying to tell them what to think. We want them to know the history and then think in light of your values. And it's become, I think it still is, even though I've been fired, the most popular course at the FBI, hugely rated. It caused some controversy among alumni of the FBI because they started grumbling, saying, why is Comey trying to tear down the FBI? And I met with a lot of the alumni and said, and explained just as I did, saying, look, constraint and oversight are essential to the operation of any law enforcement organization, especially one as powerful as the FBI. The primary lesson of this is when you're unconstrained, you fall in love with your own righteousness and you do terrible things. Everybody also heard that I did something else to supplement this course. I took the 1-page application from October of 1963, where J. Edgar Hoover wrote a 5-sentence application to Robert F. Kennedy saying, there's a communist influence in the racial situation. We need to bug this guy King. Hoover signs it October of 1963. Bobby Kennedy signs it October 1963, and they're off to the races. No limitation as to date, place, time, no oversight, no checking, like, what are your facts that would justify this? And everybody in the FBI knew the director kept it under the glass on his desk. And I kept it in the right-hand front corner, because that's where every morning I would put the stack of applications that I had to personally sign for wiretaps in national security cases. And those things are as thick as my wrist. And so I would go around and explain to the alumni and to the FBI, you know why that paper's there? Because when I put that stack down, that stack is a pain in the butt. It's a pain in the butt to get authority to wiretap someone in a national security case, as it ought to be. It's there to remind me that constraint and oversight really matters. And the absence of it, you think we've got to root out communism. There's communism among the racial situation, and so we'll destroy lots of people, including Dr. King. That's the first thing I did, the curriculum. The second thing I did is try to change the FBI. This frightened me when I became director. 83% of the special agents were non-Hispanic Caucasian. And that number had been growing, that percentage, for over a decade before I got there. That terrified me. Because at some point, I told the whole organization, this will become known as a place where white people work. And then 83% will become 100% overnight. And then the question I asked is, so are we more effective or less effective if we're all white? And the answer is obvious. I happen to think diversity is a wonderful thing, even if you don't think it's a moral value, which I do. You're less effective if it's a bunch of stiff white guys, right, trying to operate and trying to save people's lives in a country as diverse as ours. So I said, here's our problem. One of my daughters explained this to me. She said, Dad, the problem is you're the man. And I thought she meant that as a compliment, so I said, well, thank you. And she said, Dad, I don't mean that in a nice way. You're the man. Look at you. She said, who would want to work for the man? And I said, you know, you're right, but you're wrong. Because if we actually got out there and showed people what we're really like, people would want to be part of that. Almost no one leaves when they become a special agent in the FBI. 0.5%, whether you're black or white or Latino or Asian or a man or a woman, no one leaves because they get addicted to it. They come to know what it's really like. So I said, here's what we need to do. We've got to get out there and show people what it's really like. The talent is out there. The day I was fired, May 9th, I was in Los Angeles to do a diversity agent recruiting event. These things we'd had huge success with. There were 700 African American and Latino lawyers, engineers, and MBAs waiting for me that evening. And I was going to go challenge them to learn what the man is really like and to try and become part of that. And the reason it was so cool is we had done this in Houston and New York, and here the yield was unbelievable. Unbelievable. We had a class at Quantico of over 200 agents when I was director before I got fired. It was 38% non-white. So shocking for the FBI, I thought they'd hired actors to fool me when I was down there. So my mission was change this organization. And people say, oh, you're going to change the standards. I'm never going to change the standards, and I don't need to. The talent is there. They just don't know it. And so that was the second thing I tried to do. The third thing I tried to do was, in the wake of the pain and the misunderstanding and the turbulence and all of the things that flowed out of August of 2014, and all the other things you talked about, I thought, well, what can the FBI do? We're not in the policing business, but we have close relationships with the police. We do a lot of training for police leaders, and we're in every community in the United States. And so what I did was, and the first part's not that important, I gave a talk about hard truths about law enforcement and race at Georgetown. And then I ordered the FBI in every field office to convene, to bring together people from the community and from law enforcement, and use the fact that we are everywhere to bring people together. I'm a believer it's hard to hate up close. We can use the FBI to get people closer to each other and talk about, so what's in your heart and what's in my heart? And how do we get better? How do we create the systems that you've talked about so compellingly in a law enforcement environment so we don't have bad apples and so we have a healthy culture? So we did that, and we did it more than once in our field offices. And I know it's a drop in the ocean, but I was proud of it and thought that's also a signal to the leaders in the FBI. I expect engagement from you on these hard questions. So that's some of the stuff I did. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping I worked on it hard enough for 4 years that the momentum will continue despite this president, who I'm not a big fan of. I think the person who followed me at the FBI is a principled person who cares deeply about the institution, and I'm confident we'll continue they called it the Director's Initiative on Diversity. And I made diversity a core value of the FBI because I wanted people to stare at it every day when they walked into an FBI facility where you see our core values to drive that focus on it.
Interesting. I was going to ask a quick follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I know you mentioned this desire to make sure that there were no bad apples that would come out of the FBI. What do you think is the cause of the hostility that I mentioned in the story that I've retold, and this creation of what you might call a bad apple? I mention that because I know that during your tenure, you began, the reports are, which you can confirm or deny, that you began a investigation into infiltration of law enforcement by neo-Nazis and by white supremacists. And we have since seen, of course, the tragedy in Charlottesville, and the reports seem to indicate that it was more than a one-off type of infiltration, but it was a campaign where neo-Nazi organizations said, we want you to join law enforcement so that you can get training in militia tactics, get training in the use of weaponry. And so that is the type of sentiment which we saw in Ferguson, which we've seen in places like Miami Beach, Florida, where they were using the mugshots of African Americans as target practice, which we've seen across the country in the way that there's been a outright hostility on police scanners, in email exchanges between people. We saw in the Ferguson report, they called the Obamas detestable names and compared them to animals. So, that sort of sentiment just seems like such a corrosive sentiment. And it seems like, again, it's not about individual bad apples per se, but it seems like a program of infiltration that could be happening. And is there some sort of effort that you undertook to eliminate that, or did you find in your investigation that this effort is something that can be fought against? Like, how would you address that?
Yeah, good question. You anticipated, though, what part of my answer is going to have to be. I can't talk about a particular investigation that the FBI was doing, but I can say this. The FBI, as a counterterrorism division, which is divided in half, international terrorism and domestic terrorism. International terrorism you hear an awful lot about. Domestic terrorism focuses in the main on neo-Nazi groups, KKK groups, militia groups, sovereign citizen groups. And so it's always of interest to us when groups that are bent on acts of violence, whether because of a racial animus or some sense of white identity or something, to understand how they might be trying to accomplish their goals. But focusing on that is important, but I actually think the challenge in law enforcement, you can't take your eye off of that, is actually in the main much bigger and more nuanced and more challenging, because there's no doubt that there are bad apples in law enforcement, no doubt that there's racism in law enforcement. I would argue there's racism and bad apples in all parts of American society in some measure. And it may be that people who are perverted in that way may be attracted to the use of power, right? So it's a special area of concern. More concerning to me, though, is what happens to all of us. I would suggest about myself, I'm a combination of good and bad apple. I hope that the good appleness of me over time squeezes out the bad appleness of me. But as one of God's creatures, I got both good and bad in me. And so the question is, what happens to people when they join an organization, and how do we reinforce the good appleness so that the bad appleness stays in a side pocket, which I hope it does with me. The particular challenge of law enforcement is cynicism and shortcuts, which I talked about at Georgetown. There's a danger that as a law enforcement officer, and you've read a lot of this, if you work only the overnight shift, you may conclude everybody's a crook, right? Because who do you see at 4 in the morning besides people up to no good? If you work in a neighborhood where you end up locking up only Latino young men, only black young men, there's a danger that a laziness creeps in and you start to conclude, well, they're all criminals. That is a danger unique to law enforcement that we have to stare at as people who care about law enforcement, whether you're in law enforcement or not. And so to my mind, screening out and making sure you're careful when you select and hire people is really important, but worrying about what way does the culture drift over time when you're encountering things that may breed a cynicism is the primary responsibility of a leader in law enforcement, to maintain that culture. Because here's the problem with culture. It goes bad in ways you can't tell. Like air goes bad. You ever stepped into a room where somebody was cutting fish? You're like, what on earth are you doing in here? And their reaction is, I don't know, what are you talking about? Right? Why is that? Because the air goes bad while you're in it, and you can't feel it, you can't taste it. When we conduct an investigation of a corrupt police department, it's obvious. Holy cow. But you can find good people who are mostly good apple, not so much bad apple, in the middle of that culture who say, I didn't really notice. And so to my mind, what should terrorize and frighten every leader is, what is my culture like? And where is it drifting and where is it going? And how do I resist that to make sure the good appleness dominates? I'm not sure that my whole good apple, bad apple thing makes any sense, but that's how I think about it. So I just talked about law enforcement leaders. Now over to you. What do you think law enforcement leaders, maybe especially white law enforcement leaders, but I'm not sure it makes a difference, don't get about the lessons of, I don't know if it's fair to say Ferguson, because it's so much broader than that. But let's say the lessons that started in Ferguson.
It's a great question. So, actually, I think one of the main things that they don't get is that they believe that there are good apples and bad apples. I think that's a huge misconception. I think that's a false metaphor. So when I think about the desire to create a more just society, I don't want a society where we have mass incarceration, but we have all good apples in the police department and they're friendly, and yet they're still going around as they were in Ferguson, harshly administering traffic laws in a way that systematically creates a turnstile where people are constantly going back and forth from the jail back home to the jail again and back home again. You know, I don't want a universe or a world where it's okay to create these vagrancy laws so that we are systematically targeting homeless people who don't have another option for where to sleep at night and putting them in jail for trying to survive. I don't want a society where we are punishing people who are addicted to substances by incarcerating them as opposed to giving them options for rehabilitation. You know, the list goes on and on. So my vision of a just society is a vision where there's less policing, not more friendly policing. And I think that the problem with the good apple, bad apple dichotomy is that it envisions a world where the answer is police officers who are continuing to administer the same ideas of justice, the same ideas of law and order that got us here in the first place. So if you look at this question even of law and order, for example, and I think many people in law enforcement think that this is a good way to think about law enforcement. We are enforcing the law and we are creating order. But what does order mean? Who in the legislature decided what order looks like? Unfortunately, what we see on the streets most of the time, if a law enforcement person, or particularly a white male law enforcement person, encounters a young, black, LGBT person, their pants are hanging down, they're listening to certain types of music, that's disorderly by itself. As an ontological fact, you are disorder. So enforcing the law harshly against that person becomes a way of creating order in society. And so all of these laws that are very ambiguous, you know, what is vagrancy? How long is it illegal for somebody to stand in one spot? In Ferguson, we had an ordinance which was called a manner of walking ordinance, which is one of the things they suspected
manner of walking?
Manner of walking. And so if you walk in the wrong manner in Ferguson, Darren Wilson has the right to drive his car right in front of you and start cursing at you. And he's creating order. He's enforcing the law. And of course, he's not doing that in the boardrooms. He's not doing that, you know, even at the universities. He's doing that in certain neighborhoods where people like Mike Brown live and unfortunately die. So for me, this question of the good apple, bad apple dichotomy completely misses the point. I think the question that we should be asking ourselves is, how do we create a more just society? How do we create an environment where there's less of a role for law enforcement, more of a role for mental health professionals when somebody's having a mental health crisis? Mm-hmm. So when your family member has a mental health crisis, you don't want to call somebody with a gun who has the right under the law to shoot and kill whenever they subjectively feel threatened. That's a bad system. And no matter how good of an apple that police officer is, it's wrong. The situation is wrong. The encounter is a wrong encounter for us to want to create in our society as people at Howard, as people in law enforcement who are in leadership, who have the ability to create and engineer and construct different sorts of systemic orders. We have to say that is an order that we do not want to exist. We want an order to exist where the first call goes to a mental health professional, where the first call when a vagrant is in the street goes to a homeless shelter, not to a police officer. So that would be my major point of contention with the traditional view of people who are in leadership.
And I think that a lot of law enforcement leaders, especially the progressive ones, would agree with you. I brought to our last session here A.C. Roper, who's the chief in Birmingham, who I've come to be good friends with, is an ordained minister and someone who thinks well about these issues. His frustration, and that of a lot of other chiefs, is we're looked to solve all these problems. Mm-hmm. When we want to, our goal is not order, our goal is a healthy, productive community, but the community cuts back on the investment in all these other things and says, let the cops handle it. And so we end up, the mental health counselors, the drug counselors, mm-hmm. the truant officers, and so it sounds to me like that frustration resonates with you.
It does. And I think that that's our role as leaders, is to set the tone and to articulate that we want to disinvest from law enforcement, and that's all types of law enforcement. Disinvest from law enforcement and invest in healthy futures for our communities. How do we do that on all levels? I think oftentimes, especially in these political times, we have to do it on a local level.
Yeah.
And we have to allow organizations on the ground, whether they are Black Lives Matter organizations. I know the Black Youth Project in Chicago. There's the Dream Defenders in Florida. There are all these organizations of young people who are trying to create that future, and we need to invest in them, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think your point is a really important one, that I thought the Justice Department Civil Rights Division under President Obama did a great job of laying out about the systemic oppression in Ferguson.
Right.
People trapped in a system they couldn't get out. Just the ticketing system was illuminating for people who read about it.
That's right. Now, another question for you. So,
Yeah.
And I know you knew this question was coming. So, this one is about the Black Identity Extremist designation that we have heard so much about. And to be honest, when I first heard about this designation, I thought to myself, Jim Comey, he shared this memo about Dr. King to all his agents, and it seems like they took the memo, and as opposed to being inspired to do things differently, they said, well, let's just scratch out MLK and write in, these new Black Lives Matter young people, and let's do the same thing. So I would like to know from you, what is your take on this approach, and how is it different from COINTELPRO? How can we expect things to get better when it seems like history is repeating itself?
Yeah, I knew you'd ask about that. You've said some tough things about it, and I want to push back a little bit on it. The memo that generated all the controversy was written after I was fired, so I don't know exactly. I'd never heard the term Black Identity Extremist while I was director, but they haven't actually answered my questions. I don't get a lot out of the FBI these days, but I think I know what it's about. I think what it is an effort in the domestic terrorism part of the counterterrorism division to understand the threat that might be coming from people who, by virtue of a distorted view of their own race, believe they have to engage in acts of violence. As I said, we do a lot of that work with people who, because they think the whites should be dominant, that we should engage in acts of violence against people of color. As I understand it, what this was an effort to understand, are there groups, and there are, of people who believe they should engage in acts of violence by virtue of some distorted sense of their black identity. And I think what the Bureau is trying to come up with is, so what name do you give that? White identity extremism is actually not a term that you use at the Bureau because there's so many different flavors of that. There's the KKK, there are the neo-Nazis, the Aryan Nation. But what is the label you give? I think this is what they were up to when you're talking about predicated investigations of people who are engaging in or planning for acts of violence because of that view of their own race. So how is it different than COINTELPRO? It's actually the difference between that thin sheet of paper and the stack that went on top of it 40 years later. To open an investigation, the FBI, under the Attorney General's Domestic Investigation Operations Guide, has to demonstrate that there are facts to predicate a criminal investigation of a group. We have evidence that that group is engaged in violence, planning acts of violence, and then it's overseen not just in the FBI, but in the Department of Justice and audited on a regular basis to make sure we don't go back to COINTELPRO. People can disagree about the label Black Identity Extremist. I don't know what label I would give it. I know it won't surprise anyone. There are people with a misguided view of things who believe they have to engage in acts of violence against white communities because of oppression against black communities. You would expect, I think, the FBI to investigate that, to try and stop acts of violence. What label you give to it is difficult and important, but frankly not as important as understanding the oversight and constraint that's involved in the work that's done.
And
night and day.
And who is conducting this oversight again? So you said it goes through many levels of oversight this time, as opposed to in the past where it was pretty much just run with it?
Right. The illustration, the shingle sheet of paper is J. Edgar Hoover says, I want to do this. The Attorney General says, I want to do it.
Right.
Now, to be able to open an investigation, it has to be approved not just at the FBI, multiple levels, but at the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, and is audited by the Inspector General of the Department of Justice.
Right.
And if you want to use any of the tools and techniques that were used against Dr. King, you can't do it inside the executive branch anymore. You've got to go to a federal judge to get the authority, either in a national security case from the FISA court or from a judge, a regular federal judge in a criminal investigation.
And as you're aware, there's much reason for skepticism of this Department of Justice, especially under Jeff Sessions. I think who yesterday was mentioning the Anglo-American legal system as the greatest invention that he was seeking to uphold. So there's going to be continuing skepticism around the Black Identity Extremism program. And in addition, because the use of that term makes it seem like the very people who would be attracted to Wakanda and the Black Panther film are going to be investigated for that reason, with investigation being itself a type of use of the powers of the state to cause harm, because there's harm in investigation itself, out, above and beyond the actual incarceration or use of force.
Totally agree. And look, I get the skepticism. I will not be led into defending Jeff Sessions, but I will defend the department as a whole, which is resolutely apolitical. I mean, what makes it a pain to lead the Department of Justice, which I did, and the FBI is, it's really, really hard to change things because it has a ballast, a sense of pride that we do things in a certain way and we don't respond to political directive. Now, if you had a different kind of leadership for 10, 20 years, maybe you could change that, but not in the short term.
All right.
Yeah. All right, so back to you.
Mm-hmm.
So give us your assessment of where we are now in the relationship, and I know it's difficult to do in the aggregate, but I'm going to throw it at you, between law enforcement and communities of color, especially the black community. And you'll hear me do that. I'm keen, and when I was at the FBI, I did this. I like to talk more specifically because I think there's a unique challenge with the black community. And there was inside the government, there was an effort to enlarge it and talk about Latino communities, Asian communities, and I thought, yes, those are important, but I'm worried most about the relationship with the black communities. That's why I said it that way.
Yeah, so, I would have to respond that, again, I reject the premise of the question. So I don't believe we should be concerned about relationships between law enforcement communities and the black community. It seems to me it's almost like an ex-girlfriend and an ex-boyfriend worrying about the dynamics of how they relate to each other so that they can sort of reunite and everybody can hug and make up. I think that the reality is of the context. This is something I learned from critical race theory, the idea of context being king in a situation. The reality of the context is that we have 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prison population here in the United States. We have an overwhelming majority of people of color being caught in this mass incarceration system. 2 million people who are in jail or in prison, over 4 million people on parole. We know that drug enforcement, we know that people of color, especially black people in particular, make up about 13% of those who use drugs, or over 40% of those who are in jail for using drugs. So we have mass incarceration which is racialized. And when you have a context like that, not only is it wrong to think of it in terms of how do you relate, I think it's irresponsible to try to think about relationships with systems of that nature that are in the midst of what I believe are mass human rights violations. So I think it's completely wrong to think about relationships between these two groups. If you look at the history of law enforcement in the United States, which I'm sure you're also very aware of, most people would trace that history to the slave patrols in the South in the late 18th century. In the North, you had in the early 1830s the migration of some of the law enforcement practices in the UK, the Bobbies, over into the North, and you saw there was a system of controls of control of populations. In the South, it was the control of enslaved people, which took place through surveillance and investigation, and the slave patrols had the ability to break up meetings, commit violence against people who were reading or having the audacity to write even. And in the North, you had the fear of the workers, and you had the surveillance and the violence taking place, making sure that there were less strikes, making sure that these workers did not unionize. And so if you go throughout the history of the 19th century, into Jim Crow, into the early 20th century, up until the mid-60s, that history has been a horrific history. And so as a system, this system is a system which has always been, and Paul Butler is a scholar who, I mentioned to you that you should follow up on and read. He said that the system isn't broken, it's working exactly how it's supposed to work. And if you look at the history of law enforcement as a tool of social control of populations that are not in power, a tool that is something that is of use and something that is a mode of enforcement in terms of order, enforcing order, I think it's always worked in a certain way to control populations. The question we should be asking, as opposed to how do we fix a relationship, the question we should be asking is how can we completely revolutionize the system of law enforcement in the United States.
But you're the chief in Birmingham, and people are going to die tonight in your city. And when you wake up in the morning, accepting what you say, he may agree with you. What does he do? What does he do to make things better?
Right. So that is one of the core questions that I was addressing earlier. Is, again, we have to ask ourselves a question: how does a police department deter crime or stop crime, if that's its mission? And what we found, if you look at some of the studies that have taken place, throughout, the academy, police on the whole have never been proven to be able to deter crime. A better way to deter crime is to fix the system of inequality. Richard Wilkinson is a scholar who wrote a book called The Spirit Level, where he described a study at the World Bank where they surveyed 50 countries, and they found that the most violent countries were the countries, not the poorest countries, but the countries where they had the most inequality, because that inequality was the greatest incentive for people who felt pushed out to try to push their way in and push against each other out of desperation. And they had issues where their self-esteem was on the line because status was connected to poverty or wealth. And so if you really wanted to stop violence, if that police chief in Birmingham really wanted to stop the next murder, they should be engaging in a process where they took resources from their department and gave those resources to other aspects of society that might be able to limit inequality. That's what I would tell the police chief to do. How does that work on the ground? Again, if there's a homeless person, if there's a person with mental illness on the street, find a home for that person. Find an institution for that person. Don't wait for that person to commit a violent act and then incarcerate the person, and then you have to pay $25,000 a year to keep them incarcerated. And you could have paid a lot less to put them in a homeless shelter or to put them in an institution that would give them mental health assistance, right? So there are solutions that the scholars have found are effective. But I think to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And to that Birmingham police chief, the solution is always going to involve the use of law enforcement.
Well, to his great frustration, he sees, you're pushing on an open door with me and with A.C. Roper in Birmingham. One of the things I said at Georgetown a couple of years ago was, our problems are much bigger than the police. They're so hard that we have a tendency just to talk about the police. But we could have the most enlightened police officers in the entire world. Right? We could populate it with thoughtful, sensitive, open-minded, critical race theory studying police officers. If we haven't done something about all those things you talked about around it, we're in the same boat. Right? At the margins, our policing may be better, but you can't police your way to a healthy neighborhood. But the challenge, what I would push on you is, you may be right in the long term, and wouldn't it be great if this country would focus on those issues, but in the short term, he's up to his knees in violence in a place like Birmingham, and he's got to try to save lives. That's the hard part.
Right. Well, I guess that comes to a question I can ask you. Yeah. There's a term that you also may be familiar with called the Ferguson effect, or the viral video effect, where, and I'm sure you've dealt with this question before, where there's this idea that because of the viral videos, because of the protests, police chiefs who are inclined to try to deter crime or save lives are doing so less for fear, and their officers are doing so less for fear of some sort of possible interaction that could lead to them being penalized, or a video that goes viral. Yeah. So, what is your response? Because my initial response to that, of course, was, number one, it's ridiculous, but number two, this idea that it suggests an idea that we should try to lessen the amount of transparency, because this is something which is deterring people from doing their job. And I also started to ask myself, well, if they can't do their job without doing something that would go viral, maybe this supports my argument that we should have less of them. Like if I came to an to my classroom and I'm teaching, and I say, well, no video cameras today in class because I'm afraid of doing something terrible, I don't know how to teach you guys. And I don't want the video of me going up there and not teaching you to go viral. So I'm just going to sit here at my desk and not do my job and expect the same salary. And I want you to turn off your cameras. I'd be laughed out of my classroom. My dean would tell me to go home. So, but why? So, again, how is it that how is the logic sound when police officers say essentially the same thing under the guise of the Ferguson effect?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to answer this, then we're going to go to your questions, because I'm sure you're sick of us at this point. You distort me, sir. Here's what I meant and why I still think it's not a crazy idea. After Ferguson, in the early part of 2015, when I started speaking out at Georgetown, as I travel around the country, I started hearing whispering from police chiefs. Something is changing in my department. I say, what's changing in your department? They'd say, I think my officers are responding to calls, they're doing their jobs. What I'm worried they're not doing is the marginal discretionary policing, getting out of their car at 1 in the morning at a known drug corner and saying to a group of guys, hey, what's your business on this corner at 1 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday night? They're not stopping cars they ought to be stopping because they're speeding or they're running a stop sign. And they said to me, you know what I'm worried is happening? That they don't even know that they're not doing that they're hearing from their families. And the Ferguson effect is not my term, doesn't make any sense to me. What instead I was hearing was, they see all this attention to policing and they're hearing from their families, don't get famous, don't get dead. Don't get famous, don't get dead. And maybe without even knowing it, they're doing their job, but not at the marginal edge where they would otherwise encounter people informally, which I think is the essence of good policing. And so I started hearing this a bunch from people, and I kind of blow it off. Then the mayor in Chicago went public and said, my police department is in the fetal position, not doing stops anymore. And I thought, that's interesting. Then I met with a group of police officers in Cleveland, a squad, black, white, and Latino, and they told me the same thing. They said, of course we're doing our jobs, but there's no way I'm getting out into an encounter unless I have to that's going to risk me getting famous. So I thought, that doesn't make any sense. Then something ominous started to happen. Murders started to jump in over 40 of the 60 largest cities in the United States. At the end of 14, beginning of 15, in a way that made no sense to me. I looked at this and thought the numbers must be wrong. It started spiking in 40-some cities, but other cities it wasn't spiking. And it was spiking all over the country, but some cities next to others weren't seeing spikes. So I kept saying to my people, so what explains that map and that calendar? How would murders be rising and almost all of the victims were African American men? How could this be happening all at the same time, spread all over the country in places where you got a methamphetamine problem here, a heroin problem here? What explains that map and that calendar? And the more I started to talk to police chiefs, I started thinking, I wonder if there's a connection between a change in human behavior and those numbers. Not a crazy idea. If police officers continue to do their jobs but actually stop doing their jobs at the margins, what will happen to a neighborhood? And then a thoughtful police chief said, you've only got half of it. Because what if the black community, watching that same media coverage about how police officers are acting and killing people and shooting them in the back and then planting evidence at the scene, what if they, maybe without even knowing it, start to pull back from those police officers? Those encounters where someone says, hey, I'm not going to be a witness, but Joe dropped the gun over there behind the dumpster. What if those start pulling back? And in the aggregate, you could change a neighborhood. So look, still don't know whether this is true, but I thought, no one will talk about it. And the cost is lives. But no one will talk about it because it's black lives. It's those people over there. And I said, I'll be damned if I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to raise the question, say, is something changing? And so I did it. And man, was everybody mad at me. And mad at me in ways that maybe were predictable given our polarization. Everybody thought I was doing what you just said, which is drawing the next conclusion, the why behind it. You don't know this? Police unions were furious at me and condemned me. The head of the National Police Union said I was a fool, didn't know anything about policing. How dare I criticize police? People on the other side, where you were, said he's criticizing transparency. No, I'm not. I'm not criticizing either. What instead I see are huge numbers more of black men dying, and I demand an answer. Everybody was mad at me, except one person, who actually brought me to the White House, kicked everybody else out. It's very unusual for the President of the United States to speak alone to the FBI director. President Obama said, I want to talk to you, because I know your head and I know your heart. What are you seeing? What is worrying you? And I laid this out for him. I said, sir, I could be totally wrong. God, I hope I'm wrong. But something is happening, and nobody wants to talk about it. And we had this great conversation, which I'm not going to reveal all the details of, I'll keep it between us, but made me smarter and I hope was useful to him. So the homicide rate jumped in the 60 biggest cities, about 15% from 14 to 15. Then it jumped 13% from 15 to 16. It only jumped about 1.5% from 16 to 17. So maybe whatever it is going away, or maybe people have changed their behavior, I don't know. But I said to academics, I challenge you to tell me I'm an idiot. Show me the data that explains this map and this calendar, because I won't shut up, because lives are being lost here, and something is happening that we have to talk about. So that's what it was. Man, I thought that was a beating until I had to do the Hillary Clinton email thing, but I got the daylights beat out of me. But even in hindsight, I'm glad that I raised it. My views got distorted by lots of people, so what? It was important that we talk about it. So that's how I think about it.
All right.
All right?
Great.
So you want to go to the audience?
Let's go to the audience.
Okay. And how should we do this, Calvin? Do we have a microphone? There's a microphone right there at the back. So ma'am on the aisle, you want to go back to that so the people watching at home can hear you? That's great. Thank you.
All right, we're going to let the undergrads get to their next class. And that's how you know I'm a professor here. I'm Lusuga the Favorites, and I'm the Russianist here, which means before I did much of anything in my life, I studied the Soviet Union, so I got a lot of time to study and get scared about police states. Now, fast forward about 35 years, I now live in Montgomery County, so if you live in Silver Spring, you know Montgomery County, 14th largest school system in the country, and this has to do with kind of the effect of policies on police relations with the group I'm caring about right now, which is my school kids, right? So my son came back from school about 2 weeks ago, and I walked him to his bus stop at 6:30 in the morning the first few days just to meet the kids he was hanging out with, and it's a very Montgomery County crowd. It's like a third and a third and a third, right? Third white, third Latino, third black, right? And I got to meet some of the kids, and I'm like, okay, he's good. We still got him a phone for Christmas just in case, because 6:30 in the morning, it's dark. He came back about 2 weeks ago and talked to me about one of the girls at the stop. And she was very sad that day because her cousin had gotten picked up by ICE in Langley Park. This is after, and for the theologians among us, we know the church does a lot of that organizing. So the church that I go to, yes, they have also been organizing groups of basically guardians for when parents go poof. My fourth grader, about 4 weeks ago, turned to me at the dinner table and asked, Mom, do I have to be afraid of ICE? Full disclosure, I married an Iowan. So my kids, you look at them and they look more Iowan than anything. But still, my son, who goes to a school that is 80% farms and 50% English as a second language, is asking me, do I have to be afraid of ICE? At which point in time...
Can I nudge you? Can I just nudge you to ask your question? I want to make sure other people get a chance.
Yeah. So now the problem I have is I have these group of children, anybody under the age of 18, right, who is afraid of waiting for their bus. And when it comes to how do you enforce law and order, I have my Montgomery County law enforcement system that's just not going to get any answer from anybody. So kind of how do I do that when I'm in my personal, like I am the instant interpreter for the moms at the elementary school. So what do I tell them? Because now we're operating out of fear.
You want to take that?
Okay. Well, from what I understand, I think your question is, should they be afraid of ICE? And immigration enforcement at this particular moment in history? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. We've seen it from the detention of parents who are dropping their kids off at school in the morning, who are then detained by ICE officers who are waiting for them. We've seen ICE officers go into courthouses and detain people when they are showing up to represent themselves, when they receive traffic tickets, or when they're engaged in traffic violations. And we've seen the political climate of the time, from the White House to the Department of Justice, veers sharply against immigration or people who are immigrants. And so it just goes back to my point. I don't know if the answer would ever be, how can we improve the relationship between the ICE officer and the immigrant community? I think the answer has to be, how do we find a policy solution to the immigration question so that everybody can engage in trying to make the most out of their lives without having to be afraid of people hunting them down, without churches having to turn themselves into sanctuaries, and even cities having to turn themselves into sanctuaries in order to try to protect their parishioners or protect their citizens from their own federal government. So, I do think that when you, as an interpreter, as a person who works closely with these families, when you are discussing these issues with them, you have to be honest with them about everything that's happening. And they have to take precautions. They have to find ways to engage with places like the Thurgood Marshall Center, which may be able to help put them in touch with lawyers who can help to fight some of those cases. One of the reasons I became a lawyer was this idea that we can fight for justice on a case-by-case basis. And individuals, children, mothers, fathers, people who are vulnerable, people who don't know what the law is, who are caught in a cloud of fear, can look to us as civil rights attorneys or human rights attorneys, and they can find answers in us. And I'm hoping that we can train a new cadre of lawyers who will decide to do that as a mission. When they wake up every morning, they go out and they try to find ways to protect people who are vulnerable. And I'm hoping that our center will help to create people who can do that for the DC metro area and for the rest of the nation.
Next question. Go ahead, sir. Yeah, I guess, does he have to go back to the mic? Yeah, sorry.
All right. Good evening, sir. So this is for Mr. Comey, and my question currently is, so when you were talking about the screening process for some of the FBI agents, and how you would make sure that they would be morally sound and they are working in interest of the FBI and the security of the nation. So I would just say, how would you screen for that they are actually morally sound and are working in interest of the people? Because not even only in the FBI, but also in law enforcement. Like if you compare it to, say, like some of the branches of our military, like the United States Marine Corps, like constantly, day in and day out, they're constantly reminded, like, things of the fighting man's code of conduct, I'm an American fighting for freedom, etc. So, and I also received like a brief from a retired Air Force colonel where he was studying racial cases amongst the four branches, and that the United States Marine Corps had the lowest. So as some of us would know about the Marine Corps, that they have like more rigorous training, and like the amount of things that they're taught there is constantly implemented. Yeah. So would you say like a training program similar to this, like not trying to turn our law enforcement into a like almost a military of sorts, but a program similar to this would kind of amend the problem of having these stereotypes in law enforcement? Or is there another way that you would suggest?
Yeah, that's a hard question, but an important one. Start with the FBI. It's relatively easy with the FBI. All humans are flawed, so no matter how good your screening system is, some bad people are going to come through. You got tens of thousands of people, you're going to end up firing somebody every year. But in the main, it's easier in the FBI because the average age of entry for special agents is 29. And so you have a life that you can look at. You can go back, as we do, and interview teachers and neighbors and former employers and coworkers and get a picture of somebody. Then obviously you do psychological testing and those sorts of things. That's all great, but I agree with your Marine Corps comparison. The two cultures are actually very similar. That's necessary, but nowhere near sufficient. Because remember I talked about the culture earlier? Culture is best defined as the way things are really done around here no matter what they tell you in training. And so you have to constantly reinforce it with the way you discipline people, but also the way you act as a leader, as a first platoon, right, commander, or as the general in charge, the commandant of the Marine Corps. The way you act shapes that culture. It's the way you were all raised. My father was a speech giver. God love him, he's 87. I can't really remember any of the speeches. But I was shaped because I watched them. I watched my parents interact with people of a different race. I watched my mother someday, I'm sure, get too much change from the cashier. All of that shaped me. And so knowing the kids are always watching, your employees are always watching, your agents, offers you an opportunity to protect the culture and to reinforce it with the way you act. Harder in uniformed law enforcement because you're hiring, NYPD hires out of high school. There's a high school degree. One of the crises we face in this country is who are going to be the police officers in the next generation? Because the jobs are going to be filled. Would you go to Chicago and be a cop today for $35,000 a year? I don't think so. My son is an honors graduate from a great college. He's a police officer. He's 1 year on the job. He's one of the most empathetic, thoughtful people I've ever met. Thank God he's a police officer. He did it because he wants to help people. He's really interested in social justice. He's a weird kid, right? That's unusual. Not many people are going to do that. So who will be the cops in the future? This is, if you talk privately to police leaders, this is their greatest worry, is who will join, because they're going to have to hire people, and what will they be like? And how will they reinforce a healthy culture with that group of people going forward? So that's the easiest answer. That's the short answer. That's a really hard thing. Remember the kids are watching and shape the culture constantly. That piece of paper I talked about putting under my glass, I didn't make any announcement about that. But I knew everybody would talk about me because they gossip about the boss. Everybody would hear about it within a week, in distorted ways, some in accurate ways, but there's great power there. And I'll stop with this. I'm really worried. The reason I'm writing a book about ethical leadership, I'm really worried that especially this current president's leadership is going to send a message to the kids about what leadership looks like. And it is not right. And so I'm hoping I can offer a vision. I'm not a perfect person. I'm going to talk about my flaws. A vision of, so what should it look like? So that when the current storm is over, young people stay engaged in the public square. Young people like he was and I was when we were young, stay engaged and they're not turned off by saying, oh, screw all those people. I want to offer them a vision of what it can be and what it should be and hope that they'll enter the public square as police officers and as civil rights lawyers in lots of other ways. We don't want them to quit.
Thank you, sir.
There was another question. Yes, sir.
I heard you guys talk a lot about black identity extremists, and not necessarily black identity extremists, but anybody who might be a threat to the United States, like a black identity extremist or the KKK or a neo-Nazi. And also you alluded to like shutting out communism when it comes to like the Martin Luther King investigation. And so that's why I feel like my problem with law enforcement kind of stems more from how they focus on poor people and protecting property when it comes to things like Ferguson and not really protecting the people. And so it's more of an issue, like, as you were saying, about inequality and things like that. Is law enforcement is really protecting the wealth of the country and the people that have it. Like, for instance, Trump is trying to do the whole Nixon thing. So he's not going to jail. Nixon's not going to jail, well, or hasn't been to jail. And so that's really, I guess my question is, can I borrow $50? Or not really borrow, can you grant me $50 for my hieroglyphs textbook? Because I don't have any money. I don't want to go to jail. So you can meet me after the...
Did you have to?
Come to the reception. So thanks for that. I think the most we can offer you tonight is free food. Come to the reception and fill your pockets. But look, one of the police officers, good police officers, good prosecutors will tell you the proudest work they've done is in trying to help good people in the hardest hit neighborhoods. I see Professor Mohammed's in the back. Howard is pioneering a course called Policing Inside Out, which is a semester-long course made up of Howard undergraduates and police officers who sit together and see the world through each other's eyes. I think when you see, I think that both sides learn tremendously. I think what the students are most struck by is the hearts of those police officers. And the reason they think they're in policing is not to protect the wealthy, is not to keep the mansions safe, but to help those people trying to raise families in the most difficult neighborhoods. And so look, I'm putting an ad in for your course, Professor, but that course I'd love to see replicated all across the country so cops could learn from students like the great students at Howard, and Howard students could learn what's inside the hearts of those police officers.
I was going to jump in. No, I think the brother actually raised a great question because remember, there are the average police officer, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but for most police officers, if they are involved in stopping a violent encounter twice a year, stopping a violent encounter in action maybe twice a year, that's a very active year. Like most police officers on their daily beat do not interfere with ongoing violent crimes. Most police officers on a monthly basis are not involved in catching violent criminals. Most investigators are not solving murders every month. Most of the work they do sometimes involves handing out warrants for arrest or handing out tickets for people who owe $50 because of a parking violation. And those people, as we saw in Ferguson, end up in the mass incarceration system. 4 million on parole, 2 million in jail or in prison. And so it would be much more effective to take the money that could be used to create more police officers or to build more prisons and to invest in higher education and to providing more access to resources for young people so that they can get their books, get to class on time, and pursue careers like the young people here at Howard who are going to be doctors and lawyers and engineers and scientists. We have amazing people here who come from families where many of their brothers, sisters are caught in this school-to-prison pipeline or mass incarceration system, and what they lacked was resources. What they lacked was not officer-friendly, having a good relationship with them. What they lacked was not a better police department. What they lacked was the resources to provide access to higher education, or they lacked access to health care, so they had to use their money that they could have used for higher education for health care. Those are the problems that our community needs solved. We don't need more cops, we need more resources. So I think he raises a good point in that those are the types of everyday problems that 2 or 3 steps down the road, if the brother isn't as virtuous as he was and he's desperate for that book, what might he have to do to get money for that book? This is just an example.
Yep.
We see that happening all over the country, people in desperate circumstances trying to find ways to survive, getting caught up in doing the wrong thing, making mistakes, especially young people, teenagers who make bad decisions sometimes. And they're given very little room for error in our society if they come from certain places. And so those are the types of problems we need to solve.
I think most police leaders and thoughtful rank and file would agree with you, but they'd add one thing. They'd say, most of what I do as a big city police officer is respond to domestic calls, fights between families, lovers, spouses, which are terrifying, and deal with mentally troubled people on the streets. I talked to my own son about what they do. He said, I'm a social worker with a gun. That actually appeals to him. But you're exactly right. Most police officers, take New York City, which I know very well, most police officers never draw their gun in the course of their career. They are dealing with the troubled, the mentally ill, the substance abusers, and domestic violence in the main. And so what they'd say to you is, so long as you line up somebody else to deal with those problems, then you can reduce the size of your police force. We probably have time for one more question. Sir? Yep. Sir, or both of you guys, if you're up. Yep, go ahead. We got time for two. That's right. Go ahead. The gentleman standing there first, and then the gentleman with the ball cap. Go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Hansford. I had the opportunity to hear you speak.
Oh yeah, that's right. How you doing?
And
Is this a plant?
No, he's a brilliant young sophomore, right? Or freshman. Freshman. Yeah, brilliant young freshman.
Great.
and so in that conversation, you talked a little bit about how it was important for you to take Mike Brown's case to Geneva, to Switzerland, and make it a human rights case, and that you thought that it was important because of the kind of broadening effect it could have on the discussion back home about what really, what justice looks like. And so I had a question for both of you about whether or not you thought that it was important or could be important educationally to give more American police officers and citizens a broader perspective about what policing looks like in other countries around the world and America's kind of peer nations, to give us more ideas about solutions and what they could look like here.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I told you he was brilliant, right? It's a great question. So we know that in the UK, the police department there, law enforcement there, has killed less than 100 people over the course of the 20th century. And here in the United States, we have over 1,000 people killed by police officers each year. We know that the mass incarceration system, which I described, isn't replicated in Russia or North Korea or even South Africa during apartheid did not have as much of a percentage of their black population in prison as the United States does currently. So when you look at it from a global perspective, I think the question you ask is the fundamental one. What does a just society look like? Is this what a fair society looks like? Is the answer to have a better relationship with a society that creates those types of inequalities and dichotomies, or is the better solution to find a fundamental way to reorder that structure? And we know the answer is the second answer, right? But the answer doesn't come to you if you don't think in global terms. If you're not willing to compare our society to human rights ideals, not just asking yourself what is constitutional. One problem I have with the Ferguson report, it lays out a wonderful plan for creating constitutional policing in Ferguson. But even if you do everything that the Ferguson report recommends in its conclusion, we still would have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population here in the United States. And you still would have a huge human rights crisis currently and in the future, because all of these people are going to have to find a way to reintegrate themselves into society when they are released. Families have been destroyed. Communities have been destroyed. We don't see the opium epidemic being treated in the same way that the war on drugs was pursued during the 80s or in the 90s. So there are these huge harms being committed, and there are huge dichotomies, huge distances between the way the black population has been treated by this country and the way the white population has been treated by this country. That's the crisis. That's what we have to put our time and our energy and our money towards solving. It's not about creating better individual relationships or even screening for better individual people. I feel that it's important to do it, but I don't think it's going to solve the problem that the young man raised.
Good answer. The last question, sir. Yep.
Hi, my name is Nasrel. Good evening, everybody. Sophomore political science major from Detroit, Michigan. I'm just here two questions really quick. James Comey, I know you're 6'8". Hope to see you in Burr soon. Second question.
You don't want any part of that. That's a torn Achilles right there.
Okay, second question is more serious. My personal belief is that we talked about relationships between the federal policing and state policing and things like that is being more tarnished, and how there's really a lack of relationship because systematic actual oppression through status quo actions, right? More so than they don't know that they're committing these acts of white supremacy because it's what is the law. In my belief, this is one of my beliefs. I was going to ask, this is open for both of you, of course. Do you believe that the current system can be revised or revolutionized to change these relationships between black people, minority groups, Latinos like immigrants, or Native Americans even so? Can that current FBI or the state policing ever be revolutionized to actually fit these communities and help these communities? Or do we need to completely go about a new way of doing federal or state type of policing? Because we look at the UN, how they do their human rights, but it allows things like Darfur to happen where there's too much lack of passiveness and there's not enough action. So this is a really abstract question, of course, but I just wanted to abstract answer.
It's a great question to end on. I'll give you the last word. I'll answer first. He'll have a more thoughtful answer. But my answer is, because I'm essentially an optimist, yes, but nowhere near fast enough. Right? Policing is better in the United States than it was 30 years ago, than it was 50 years ago. Right? I remember I watched President Obama's commencement address here where he cataloged all the ways in which lives are better, not just for people of color, but for all Americans, and nowhere near fast enough. The challenge I have for Justin is we got to wake up tomorrow in a country with more guns than people, where a lot of people are going to die. What do we do tomorrow? And his job is to think about, so what do we do over the long run? But it's going to, nowhere near fast enough, but yes, it can change. Over to you.
All right, so I also will be optimistic. I think, yes, it can change for the better. Surprising to have optimism, but not because I think that American society has currently has the solution written in its constitution. And I agree with you with the atrocities in Darfur or Rwanda. We saw the UN human rights system also fail black people in particular. But I think it's up to people like yourself, young people at Howard University, these thinkers, these scholars, these intellectuals, to figure out what our new system of justice will look like. How do we find a model in the history of our community or in the broader scholarly discourse around restorative justice, or in societies in other places of the world? How do we find a model to copy, to take some examples from? How do we reconstruct our ideal of justice so that we can find a way to create a community that makes sense and that is healthy and that is strong and that is fair and that is just for everybody? I think we're going to have to find a solution on our own. I don't think the tools that we have currently are enough, but I think we'll get there one day.
Thank you. And before we close, I'm going to ask Professor Hansford, as the leader of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, if you could give some direction to our young people who may have an interest in civil rights and want to get engaged in the work, how they can get more engaged in the work that is taking place at the law school.
All right, so come to the law school. And we have our dean here, Dean Danielle Holly Walker, who is our leader. And so she's someone you can come and talk to after the program. We're going to have a student interest meeting here on main campus in the coming weeks, so be on the lookout for that announcement. So we'll find ways for you to not only get engaged, but even more so, we want you to take the lead on your own project. So if you have something that you're passionate about, whether it is policing, whether it is the question of housing rights, whether it's the question of reparations, whatever it is, I want you to be able to come to us and find resources here at the Thurgood Marshall Center, here at Howard University, to support you, the future leaders of our community. So be on the lookout for an interest meeting that's going to come up. It's probably going to be in early March. And feel free to email me, justin.hansford@law.howard.edu, and stay plugged in, because we're going to be very active, and we're planning a launch in the fall. So for those of you who are freshmen, sophomores, or juniors, be on the lookout for that launch.
Excellent. I'm going to ask if Dean Holly Walker and the outstanding faculty from the law school will just stand so that our young people will know who you are and if they have. And so Dean Holly Walker, the faculty of the law school, Director Comey and Professor Hansford will be engaged in a reception that is taking place in the museum straight down. And so I'm going to ask if you have questions for them, and they will be here throughout, if you follow them to the museum so they don't get stuck here answering questions. And our faculty and colleagues from the law school will also be happy to answer any questions that you may have. But before we do that, please join me in giving a hand to Director Comey and Professor Hansford.
All right, good job. You're doing well. Okay.
An excellent engagement.